G'day everyone, Diggo here with my very first kick-ass product review. It is the TourBox Neo. For those who don't know what a TourBox is, it's essentially a macro board designed with artists in mind. I was approached by the folks at TourBox to give some opinions of it and provide a review. And although this video is sponsored by them, be assured that the opinions I express here are completely my own. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, the whole point of the TourBox is to help artists enhance their creative workflow by allowing them to be less reliant on their keyboards, reducing travel time between swapping out tools and functions, and overall providing a more comfortable creative experience. So how does it do that? What's it worth? And how does it work? And more importantly, is it actually useful for me as an artist? I've been using the TourBox across multiple apps for over the past few weeks, so I'm excited to give my thoughts about it. And if you like this review and you find that you may be interested in buying one of these, there is an affiliate link below in the description. So, starting with the hardware. The TourBox is a weird, blobby looking device and kind of reminds me of a toy you would give to a small child or toddler to help develop their fine motor skills. It's got different shaped buttons, several dials, and a D-pad, which can all be customized to serve different functions depending on the app you want to use it with. However, its looks are pretty deceiving here, and despite its plasticky looking exterior, the thing is pretty damn weighty and is coated in a nice rubberized plastic which makes it soft to the touch. The TourBox also fits in the hand quite comfortably, though I would wager that its thickness and height might be a little bit uncomfortable for those with smaller hands. Now, it connects to your PC through a USB-C braided cord. However, note to the TourBox developers here, if you can make this thing wireless, that would be absolutely sweet. On the device, there are 14 direct buttons and 3 dials. You can also combine button presses with combo macros. At the time of this video, 42 combinations can be programmed, which is pretty nuts. The layout of the dials is adequate, though I think the placement of some of the buttons could be improved in future versions to reduce rearranging your hands, as some combos of button presses does require a decent level of contortion. All the buttons and dials do have nice clicky feedback. However, the dial clicks do have a bit more resistance to them, which could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your preferences. Personally though, I wish the dials were a little bit easier to press. The different shaped buttons are awesome though, because unlike a keyboard or the direct buttons on say a tablet, it requires way less muscle memory to remember the button placement when working with it. Speaking of all these buttons, let's talk about setup. Now, for a device designed for such a specific market, I was surprised at how easy it was to set up. Even compared to say drawing tablets, downloading and installing the drivers were a breeze, and within moments of installing the TourBox, I was off to the races trying to set up different macros for different software. The nice thing about the TourBox is that you can make different presets for all kinds of apps, and as you switch between them, it will automatically swap out the macros you've set up for each app, which is really nice in my opinion. Setting up the macros are quite straightforward. All you gotta do is click on the button you want to program the keystroke to, and it will automatically highlight that button press, which avoids you from hunting around for the right button on the screen to connect to the right keybind. It also detects button press combos and double clicks on almost every button, which is really useful if you want to add as many key combos as you can for the app that you want to use. That being said, you don't need to customize one out of the box, as it comes pre-installed with a number of presets for Photoshop, Lightroom, and Premiere Pro. You can even download a whole swath of other presets from the TourBox website. Sadly though, there's no presets for apps like Maya or Blender, so I had to make my own presets for that. There are presets for ZBrush though, and although I didn't have a chance to try the TourBox with it, I can definitely see the TourBox being handy for it. So let's talk about my actual day-to-day experience with it. Personally, I absolutely loved using the TourBox with Photoshop. Overall, I felt like I worked through my sketches way faster, and having a dedicated macro for undo and redo without having to reach for the keyboard is fantastic. The dials for resizing my brush sizes and opacity were also super useful, and I can see myself using this from now on for any project that requires me to sketch out my ideas beforehand. Now, for those who have tablets with express keys, you might be wondering how it compares to that. Well, personally, I prefer the TourBox without question. The current tablet I have is the XP Pen 24 Pro, and that has a bunch of express keys on them. And although they are nice to have, programming them is a long, arduous process compared to the TourBox, and I have to reach forward to touch them whenever I have to, say, press undo for a mistake. With the TourBox, however, I find that I can keep a better posture whilst drawing, and that also reduces overall strain. The unique button shapes also aids in that process too, because it avoids me from misclicking the wrong macro, which is something that I would always happen to do when I use the Express keys on the 24 Pro. The other nice thing about using the TourBox over the Express keys is that all the macros that I have programmed are now situated on my left side of my body. So basically I'm using my left hand for all my shortcuts, leaving my right hand free to keep drawing on the tablet without having to reach down to my keyboard or reach down to the right side of my screen to choose those macros on my Express keys. The TourBox also comes pre-installed with a set of presets for Photoshop, Premiere, and Lightroom. And for the default macro setup that I used for Photoshop, I found that it was intelligently laid out and I felt no particular need to modify the presets, which was also a relief. Within about an hour of use, I felt myself already instinctually reaching out to the TourBox over the keyboard when making adjustments to my toolset. That, however, unfortunately cannot be said for 3D application use, such as Blender. Well, so far at least. The hard thing about using the TourBox with something like Blender is how keyboard shortcut dependent the app is, and learning to understand what your most commonly used tools are in your day-to-day work. Deciding what my macros should be for Blender was actually surprisingly difficult, and I'm wondering whether it's less a detriment to the TourBox as it is to Blender's absolute reliance on keyboard shortcuts. However, given that reliance though, you might be thinking that the TourBox should be perfect for Blender. Well, it depends on your workflow. So for example, I'd go and set up my macros for a bunch of tools that I thought I would use most often, only to realize that I have completely forgotten about a function that I use in a different mode within Blender. This is compounded by the fact that the same keyboard shortcuts serve different functions in Blender, depending on what mode you're in. So for instance, pressing I in object or pose mode will set a keyframe, whereas pressing I in edit mode will inset a face. So getting that balance is hard, and something that I think would take more than a couple weeks to get right. And that's where I would recommend, if possible, that the TourBox devs start to include built-in function lists for 3D apps such as Maya, Blender, and the like. They already have some for ZBrush, so why not just add a couple for the other mainstays as well, like they have for Photoshop, Lightroom, and Premiere Pro. Then that would be absolute aces. That being said, if I manage to figure out what the most comfortable layout is within Blender, I reckon it could be a real asset in optimizing my workflow. I'm already seeing the potential here. For instance, having Control, Shift, and Alt all programmed under my thumb and index finger is great. And I have the edit mode button programmed to the button closest to my middle finger. The biggest advantage here? Not constantly pressing the caps lock button instead of tab. That alone shows me the potential of this device. The question is now, what other keyboard binds do I program in conjunction to those main four? That is something that I'm still working out, and if anyone else out there owns a TourBox and uses Blender with it, I would love to know what your macro layout is. Speaking of which, sharing your macro setup is easy as piss too, surprisingly, as you can export out the shortcut set and install it into any computer you want. I already have formed the habit of saving my shortcuts to OneDrive, so I can just chuck them on my laptop as well. Now on to a little bit of fun. Since the TourBox is completely customizable, I thought I'd give it a shot with some less conventional apps, such as maybe a video game. And I've gone with Age of Empires 2. I love playing that game, and I thought maybe if I give it a shot, maybe I'd learn how to play a little bit better. And surprisingly, yes, it actually worked. I programmed the button to some basic villager and building commands, and for a shitty average player like myself, I definitely felt more in control when playing it, and it was super fun to try. Here's a little sample. So I guess the last question to answer is whether or not it improved my workflow. And the answer to that is, well, that it depends. If you're using something like Photoshop on a day-to-day basis, then I'd say hell yeah, it's fucking great. I definitely felt myself working faster with it, and I can wholeheartedly recommend this device when using it with Photoshop. Will it make me a better artist? Well, probably not, but that's not really what the purpose is. It's about making you more efficient. And for those who are using it for something like Maya or Blender, well, that is completely dependent on your skill set in those softwares, how you use them, and what shortcuts you think you would benefit from using less keyboard travel. I think that if you buy one of these things with the mindset that it will take time to hone in your macros to suit your workflow, then yes, you should consider this device. If you're the kind of person who doesn't want to deal with that kind of malarkey of setting up everything manually, then fine-tuning things to your approach, and just wants a preset handed to them, then you might want to consider something else. And that definitely comes into play when you factor in the price. Currently, the price for the TourBox sits at around $169 dues. Now, let me tell you, for a creative piece of hardware, that's actually not bad. And if you're working as a professional, it's an easily justifiable tax deduction. But for students and hobbyists, well, that's a different question, and it's really up to you as to whether you think that price is justifiable. And when you couple that with the fact that if you are a hobbyist or a student and you're still trying to learn what the actual workflow principles are for any given software, you may want to hold off on getting such specialized tools until you get familiar with the software you're using. But again, these sort of tools are really designed for those who are already professionals and working on these sort of softwares and working with these tools on an everyday basis. And on that level, I would definitely recommend something like this. I'm already finding that under certain circumstances, my workflow is actually getting faster just by using this thing. So I think once I start to apply this to other tools such as Substance Painter, Maya, and if I ever open up ZBrush, I'll give that a go too. I think it would be really useful. So that's it for this review. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you found it useful. If you are actually considering buying one of these things, please consider clicking the affiliate link below to get $10 off your purchase of the TourBox. So to wrap up, I'm just going to say thank you for watching, and I will catch yous.